Hey friends, it's Corey from Hey Let's Make Stuff. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the different types of protective sheets you might use with your heat transfer projects. When you're working with HTV, sublimation, DTF transfers, or white toner prints, you are most likely going to be using a protective sheet somewhere in the process. But there are a lot of options. We're talking about butcher paper. What color do you want? We have parchment paper, we have Teflon sheets, we have wax paper. All of these are different types of protective sheets that we could be using in our projects. But not every project is created the same, and the type of sheet you are using can really affect your final project. And then in addition to affecting your project, it can also help prevent damage to your actual heat press. So choosing the right type of protective sheet is actually a really important choice when you're doing any sort of heat transfer project. Let's start by talking about wax paper. So wax paper comes on a roll like this, and you are going to immediately take this back to your kitchen and you're never going to bring it to your craft room again. And that is because wax plus heat equals a big melty mess. So I do get the question a lot, can I use wax paper instead of parchment paper or butcher paper? And the answer is a firm no. You don't even want to be using wax paper when you're working with hot food because it melts the wax. The wax is actually a fairly low temperature melt. So if you put any type of heat on here, it's going to melt, it's going to ruin your project, it can even ruin your press. So if you're thinking about wax paper, go ahead and take this one back to the kitchen and never think about using it for your heat transfer projects. That leaves us with a Teflon sheet, butcher paper, and parchment paper. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about each of those and which projects that you're going to want to use each of them for. The first one here is a Teflon sheet. So I have quite a large Teflon sheet here. They can come smaller. You can also cut them down. And basically this is what the name would suggest. It is a sheet made of Teflon. And if you think about Teflon, it's the stuff that makes your pans not sticky. So this is basically a non-stick cover sheet. Having a non-stick cover sheet is great, but honestly, this is not my favorite for most crafting applications. Number one, I think it is great for HTV. So if you're pressing something with heat transfer vinyl, you peel back that carrier sheet and you need a final press, Teflon is a really great option. You can also get a Teflon cover that covers the top plate of a heat press. That's a great option if you're doing a lot of HTV, but for me, primarily Teflon works best with HTV. I think you could also use a Teflon sheet for pressing a white toner print in a pinch. However, I really do think parchment paper is going to be the better choice there. So for HTV, there are some pros to using a Teflon sheet. The first is that it's very durable and long lasting. So you can use this basically as many times as you want. I have never had one wear out. So if you're just looking for something that's going to last and work with your HTV projects, a Teflon sheet is a great option. Additionally, it has that non-stick surface. It has really even heat distribution, so it works really well with HTV. And it's easy to clean if needed. There are some cons to the Teflon sheet, and that's what makes it not good for some of our other projects. One thing that it does is it actually can trap moisture, and this is particularly bad for sublimation. So there are people who say they want to use a Teflon sheet for sublimation. I just don't recommend it because of that moisture issue. The second issue is that you can do ink transfer onto this Teflon sheet. One of the reasons we generally use butcher paper with sublimation is because it's disposable. So if you get that ink blow through on sublimation, you can just toss it. If you get the ink blow through on a Teflon sheet, however, there's going to be ink on the Teflon sheet, and then it can transfer to your next project, totally ruining that next project. And then the only other con I have for a Teflon sheet is that compared to our other options, it is a little bit expensive. However, you can still get these on Amazon really cheap. When I first started crafting, they were a little bit harder to find, they were more expensive. Now every other crafting shop is selling them on Amazon, so you can get one that's not very expensive. Next up is butcher paper. And butcher paper is exactly what you might think it might be. It is for the butcher. The butcher is going to wrap up your piece of meat so you can take it home, and they use this uncoated paper to do so. Butcher paper comes in two colors. You can either get it in white or you can get it in brown. And I highly recommend getting it in white. I don't think people have a lot of issues with the brown, but there have been instances of color transfer. So you don't want that brown color sort of transferring to any of your blanks. So I highly recommend getting white. Butcher paper also comes in sheets or on the roll, and I am a huge fan of these 12 by 12 sheets. I just find them so much more easier to work with than the roll. You can definitely use the same roll that you would get of butcher paper that you might get and have for your kitchen. However, I think buying it in the sheets, even though it is a little bit more expensive, is just so much easier because you're not dealing with the curling of the paper. So what is butcher paper good for? The best uses here are going to be sublimation, like I mentioned before, and also pressing DTF transfers. You can try using it with HTV and white toner prints. However, with both of those, I do feel like it is more likely to stick, and that's why I would go with a non-stick option like the Teflon sheet or the parchment paper, but you can use butcher paper if you're in a pinch. The pros to butcher paper for sublimation and DTF prints is that one, it's very inexpensive and widely available. Like I said, you can buy sheets on Amazon, they're very easy to get, and you can buy like a pack of 100, so it will take you a while to get through the whole stack. Because butcher paper is uncoated, there's no chance that it's going to leave any sort of residue. So I mentioned that wax paper before. Butcher paper has no coating, so there's no way it's going to leave anything behind. Both the Teflon sheet and the parchment paper do have a coating, a nonstick coating. However, I'm not worried about either of them leaving something behind, but that doesn't mean they won't. If you're working at really high temperatures, the parchment paper in particular, I don't know, I feel like it could get a little dicey. However, the butcher paper has no coating, so if you definitely don't want to ruin your project, butcher paper is a great way to go. There are really only two downsides to using butcher paper. The first is that, like I said, it doesn't work so great for HTV or white toner prints. However, you can always test it might work for you. The other is that it's basically one-time use, especially for sublimation. If you're using it for DTF prints, you can use it more than once, but for sublimation, you might get that ink blow through. And basically that means that you're going to get ink on this butcher paper, and if you try and use it with another project, you can transfer that ink back onto your second project. Even if you don't see ink on here, there is a possibility it exists. Sometimes I will reuse butcher paper if it looks really clean, but I do feel like it's always a risk. There's colors like yellow that don't show up. It just looks a little bit burned because it's been in the hot heat press, but maybe it's actually yellow ink that you're going to be transferring to another project. So in general, best practice would be to not reuse your butcher paper unless you really feel like there is no ink on it at all. And then finally here I have parchment paper. Now parchment paper is another non-stick option that you see a lot in baking, and the non-stick is actually a very thin silicone coating. This is why it's so great for making cookies. The cookies just slide right off, but it does have some good crafting applications as well. Parchment paper is ideal for me for white toner printing, and it is what most white toner printers suggest. There are several parts of the press with white toner printing, but there is a part where you do need to press with a cover sheet, and I highly recommend parchment paper because it's non-stick. You can also use it with DTF transfers. However, I would just go with the butcher paper because it tends to be less expensive. You can also use it with HTV if you don't want to get a Teflon sheet. You don't, however, want to use it for sublimation, again, because that nonstick surface is going to trap that moisture, which is especially bad for sublimation projects. The pros to parchment paper are that it is nonstick, so it works really well for those nonstick applications. It's inexpensive, it's widely available, and you can use it a bunch of times. You're not going to have the same issue that you're having with the butcher paper where you need it to be throwing away each piece because you're not going to be using parchment paper for sublimation. There's just a couple cons. Like I said, it holds moisture, not good for sublimation, and it's not as durable as something like a Teflon sheet. So these two can probably be interchanged. I would do this mostly for white toner printing and this for HTV, but honestly, they're both nonstick surfaces, so you can probably use both for either. But overall, this has like a limited durability, right? You can use a piece of parchment paper a bunch of times, but it's still not going to last as long as a Teflon sheet. All right, so those are the 4 types of sheets you might use to protect your press and your project when you're making a heat transfer project. Again, wax paper, it's going back in the kitchen. So we just have these 3 that we're going to talk about. And now I want to talk about them based on the type of project you're doing. So if you're doing HTV, you're going to want to use the Teflon sheet or the parchment paper. If you're doing sublimation, really your only choice here is that uncoated butcher paper. For a DTF, you could probably use any of these in a pinch. However, butcher paper is my favorite because it's least expensive. And then finally, if you're doing a white toner print, I highly recommend parchment paper. All right, I hope you found this overview of different types of protective sheets helpful. If you have a different type of project and you're looking for which one you might want to use, go ahead and leave me a comment and maybe I can steer you in the right direction. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. Follow my channel for more crafty content. I'll see you next time.